Okay, well, thanks for having me. And what you've asked me to do is to more or less summarize about 30 years of experience that I have in about 20 minutes. So it's going to be quick. It's also maybe going to be a bit more abstract than I normally like to talk, because we sort of, over the years, there's lots of experiences in design education that I'd love to share. So I hope this is the first of many meetings, workshops, or whatever we can do together. So just to introduce myself, you know who's talking. My name is Kees Dorst. I'm Professor of Design Innovation at UTS in Sydney. I've got a background in design and in philosophy. And you have to understand that between design and philosophy is this kind of swamp, which I try to fill with books. So I write books on how creative processes work, particularly design processes, but lately also more broadly. So these are some of the books. And in this talk, I'd like to focus on one of those, but you'll see that one later. I'm also working for the UN at the moment, focusing on reorganizing the UN for the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. But first, because I've only got 20 minutes, we still need to step back a little bit and go, okay, why would design-based education actually be relevant right now? Not just within design, the designing fields, but much more broadly. And so this is the philosophy me talking. I think it's probably because the problems of the world have become more open, complex, dynamic, and networked than ever before. And that is a problem for our organizations, because our organizations are kind of problem-solving machines. They like to own problems, simplify them, freeze them, and then own the solution. Well, in a world that is open, complex, dynamic, and networked, all of our organizations will have to become open, complex, dynamic, and networked themselves, because organizations have to mirror their relevant environment. So how do you do that? Or what does this actually mean? I think the sting in this case is in the complexity of it, because in a very complex environment, it means that you can't do problem solving anymore, not in the way you used to, because the links of causality are actually very weak in a complex environment. You can't say, if I do this, then that will be the result. No, if I do this, lots and lots of things will start to happen, because everything is so incredibly connected and networked in a complex environment. So this actually pulls the rug from under our organizations, how we organize ourselves, how our organizations think. It also pulls the rug from under our disciplines, because they all have their own ways of solving problems, of attacking problems. But if you can't even define a problem anymore, and you can't solve anything anymore, because in a complex environment, you can't solve anything, you need to create interventions that move the whole system to a better state. That's the game that you're in a complex environment. This means that we've got a lot of things that are that used to work and used to work really well, and that we created lots of sophisticated structures about, that need to be rethought. And of course, this is not new. It's been going on for quite a while. So I guess design thinking as a term of interest to organizations, governments, educational establishments has been around for about 15 to 20 years by now, because designers have been dealing with open, complex, dynamic, and networked problems for a very long time, and have managed to develop practices, ways of working that actually address these. So it is good to look at design for inspiration for your own field, to see, okay, what practices from design can we adapt that will actually help us deal with this open, complex world. At the same time, there has to be a little bit of a warning. A lot of what you see in design thinking around the world is actually business schools rebadging things that they were doing already. So a lot of design thinking that you see around is focused on things like brainstorming, which is not something that designers do at all. I've studied expert designers for about 30 years. They don't brainstorm. Yet the whole design thinking movement is more or less built on that as one of its bases. So you have to be a bit careful, but there are practices in design that are actually very relevant right now in ways that they weren't before, and that might be useful for you in your own field to extend the repertoire of the way you think, of the way you approach the problems, and the way you approach the world. So I think in general, design thinking is a good idea. It's just that the superficial version of it is a bit of a red herring. It doesn't lead you anywhere. And of course, what you do when you want to study design is you talk with designers, you interview designers. And I just picked out a couple of quotes from hundreds that I have. The top one is an interesting one. So Ted Happold is a structural engineering designer. He designs very, very big bridges. And he says that he likes to live in an area of total uncertainty. You think, oh, that's not a good plan. Yet that's very much a design attitude. The other sort of another sort of hard-nosed engineering designer just starts with drawing something, because it's not much use thinking. Just start drawing and then your thoughts will be clearer. And there's an architect who arrogantly says that he knows better than the client and he's going to change the brief on them. So yet this is normal design thinking. So what's happening there? Well, you can also do research into design. So this is my friend Brian Lawson, who gave a certain exercise. He's a psychologist in background, a psychologist and an architect, who gave a little exercise, a little puzzle to play with for architects and for mathematicians. And in this case, the mathematics students were capable of solving that by looking at the structure of the problem and then solving it, while the architects started to create high scoring solutions of it could be like this, it could be like that, and trying to find one that was acceptable. So the mathematicians were problem focused, the architects were solution focused. But why is that? Well, architects are used to dealing with problems that have no structure. Lots of stakeholders, lots of variables in a building. There is no structure there to discover. The only way to create progress is to move forward. And that's actually the same as what you see generally in dealing with complexity. If you want to understand complexity, you can map it forever. You'll never finish. But if you start interacting with it, intervening into it, you can see which of the links that are potential are actually important. So being more experimental, being more interventionist, more or less in the way these architects were, works really well for problems that have little or no structure. Unfortunately for these guys, it actually didn't work very well on the puzzle that Brian Lawson, the psychologist, gave to them, because all the mathematicians actually solved it and none of the architects did. Because for this particular problem, it was the wrong approach. And again, so apparently there is something different about how designers think. Or how designers approach the world. And to explain that a little bit, the only thing I need to do is take an old equation from Peirce about a reasoning pattern, where you go, okay, we reason with elements, we connect them, and that leads to an outcome. And the only thing I need to do to explain where design sits in this is predicate logic. So this is your Tuesday afternoon predicate logic lecture for 2 minutes. Can't hurt, come on. What you look at then is, okay, how do different fields organize themselves in this? Well, if you look at deduction, you know the elements in a situation, you know how they hang together, so you can reason towards a conclusion. Okay, great. If you look at induction, you know the elements in a situation, you know that something is happening, you've observed something, but you don't know how that happens. So the question mark is actually in the how. Which is tricky, because that means that you have to propose a way of working, a how, and then see whether that fits or not. That's what we call a hypothesis. So you hypothesize that something works in a certain way and you see whether the equation then works. So deduction and induction are the two things that we do when we want to look at the world as is. If we want to create new things, we end up in abduction. So the outcome now is a value that you want to create. And sometimes you know the how. You're in normal abduction, and you still have to make a what. I'll skip the examples because I don't have time for it, but there's a longer story behind this. So this is, for instance, what you see in engineering a lot. The how is not under discussion. We know how to build a bridge, but we still have to do it. We still have to design it. So this is really, really hard. And you're reasoning backwards. You're reasoning from value back to the cause. In this case, that's hard. In design abduction, the shit really hits the fan, because there's two unknowns in this one. You know the value you want to create, but you don't know how, and you don't know with what, because that's what you have to design. which means that you have to propose the how and the what and see whether you can make it work, which is actually what makes design quite a playful process, because you have to sort of try something out, learn from that experiment, try another thing out, etc., etc. So that's what the basis of design thinking. There's very little structure to build on. The how isn't known, so you have to create the how as well as the what. And that means also that the how and the what are both shifting, which means that there is a co-evolution between what you see as the problem and what you see as the solution. Both of them are at play within design. This is sometimes very hard for people to understand, also people in other creative professions. A friend of mine, he works in Oslo and works at a very sort of hard-nosed technical university at an engineering department, so doing normal abduction. And he comes in third year with a design studio, with a very big open question. We have to create value here. How can we do that? And he tells a story of that in one of the first times that he ran it, a third year student of his came up to him in tears and really upset, saying, "I am an engineering student. I have a right to know what the problem is." Which really sort of shows the misunderstanding of design often. And also that playfulness of design, the fact that you are proposing lots of things and trying to make them work, is not something that you normally see in a hard-nosed organization that tries to build itself on deduction as much as possible. So it is a different way of thinking. And then the question for today is, of course, how do you get people into this way of thinking? What does it consist of, and what can you do? So I'm drawing on my own. So in the course of my career, I've set up 6 new design schools, departments, faculties for universities in this kind of space, moving from the design space to a more general transdisciplinary space that I guess you guys are in. But I'll start drawing on the design bit as a core and then move to the more transdisciplinary thinking, if Arwin allows me the time. I'll mostly draw on a book that I wrote together with Brian Lawson on design expertise, which is really basically a how-to book of how to set up a design school. It's a couple of 100 pages with lots of examples, so I won't go into the details. I'll just show you some of the models that sort of guided our thinking in this. One of them, of course, is when you're talking about setting up an educational thing, it is about expertise. It is about expertise development for your students. And we use the model by Dreyfus on expertise development, where you basically say, well, a novice thinks in a convention-based way. They're trying to sort of find out the rules of the game. How does this work? An advanced beginner is somebody who's situation-based, who realizes that the rules are not strict, but that in some situations you do this, in other situations you do that. Somebody who's competent actually creates situations by having a strategy, so is much more empowered. And then an expert is somebody with lots of experience by definition, so they often work very implicitly, because they've got all this experience, they know what to do. A master is somebody who starts to develop the field, develop new schemata, develop new ways of working. It's much more explicit at that, where the expert is quite implicit. And the visionary sets out to redefine the field. So, and the reason that there's this little arrow is in the middle is that when you're in a design school, you probably do novice and advanced beginner, and your very best students may end up being competent. But the later phases you just don't get to. Design fields are incredibly complex. Everything that you're doing is very situated. So building up expertise actually goes very slowly. The Royal Institute of British Architects has a competition for young architects, and young is under 50. You're not expected to do any useful work when you're below 40. So while design always shows itself as sort of being very young and dynamic, design expertise is very slow in developing, because you need to have seen lots of experience, have experienced lots of design situations to find your way into this field. There's just too many variables in a sense. So be careful with people saying that I've done a 2-day course on design thinking and I'm now a designer. Keep going, I would say. It takes much longer than that. Also, if you just look at the design actions that we've structured our book around, so this is what you do when you're designing. You're framing problems, you're formulating them, you're moving, etc., etc., etc. These are all specific actions that designers, design practitioners, and people in design schools have developed lots of tools and methods about. So this is more or less the backbone of the design actions that you want to stimulate. And again, it's a very long list. It's very complex. How do you get there? Well, one of the things is that you have to start with situated thinking. It is about looking at different situations and understanding how, as a designer, you can navigate into them. So that's where books like Suchman, sort of plans and situated actions, have been very influential in how we design courses. It is also about propositional thinking. This is where Nigel Cross and his the nature and nurture of the design ability comes in. He actually has a list of design abilities that he sees as crucial. And this is also where my own thinking about framing and co-evolution comes in. It is about changing the problem as well as the solution at the same time. It is about that game. And people have described that as iteration, but it's actually a co-evolution of these two. And that's a deeper process. Now, design education traditionally is based on a thing that we call the studio, which is where this is all supposed to happen. And the studio, I have a kind of love-hate relationship to the studio, because yes, it is absolutely great to give people open challenges, but how do you do that? And how do you do that efficiently and effectively is a big question. So one of the things that Brian Lawson and I said in our book on design expertise was, okay, if you go to design schools anywhere in the world, they all more or less look the same. If you go to another faculty in your university, you're in a completely different universe, but design schools all look the same. And that means that either we actually know how design works and how to teach it, or we're all copying the same model. And I guess it's sort of the second one. The Bauhaus is still very strong as an influence. And what we try to do in our book is get beyond that and be more specific about, okay, what are these design abilities? What are these design skills? And how can you actually teach them within the studio, but also outside of the studio? Because what the studio tries to do is mimic practice, but you can't really. So it all becomes a bit artificial. And because the students understand that they're not making something for practice, they're just trying to satisfy their tutors. So there's a little bit of a lie around the studio environment. It is aimed at bringing around sort of getting tacit knowledge into the students' heads, that sort of navigation knowledge about when do you do what, but there might be more efficient ways to do that. Studios inevitably focus on projects, while a lot of the higher levels of design expertise go beyond projects. Studios, when you're in a design school, are all designers working together in monodisciplinary teams. That's actually not like practice at all. So it's the most inefficient thing you can do is have generalist designers sitting in a team together. So that won't happen in practice. There is a kind of master-apprentice model, which is really nice because you can actually help people through their learning cycles. On the other hand, a lot depends on the quality of the master, and also the click between the master and the student. And that's a risk in the model. It's also when we do these design studios, there's lots and lots of them in design schools. And they're all very different because you're trying to cover a very broad field. And that actually makes them very hard to learn from. Because if you first designed one thing and then designed another thing, what does that say about design? It's actually very hard to connect those experiences. And we aren't very good at that. And at the same time, because in a studio you have to make something, it also gets a little bit repetitive. So I think there's good things about a studio. There's absolutely what you need to do in design anyway is give people open challenges and see how they move the problem and the solution. Otherwise you miss the dynamics and then you really miss design. On the other hand, can we sort of pick out elements of the studio that are useful and let go of some of the other elements of the studio? Because just mimicking practice, it's also didactically naive. We know more about learning than just mimicking practice. Come on, we can do better than that. So let's talk about the studio later on. And of course, what you do in the studio is learning from experience. which is a lot of the things that sort of our education gets to be based on anyway. What you see in design is that, okay, the good thing is that students are really immersed in the problem field in the studio, but it's also very confusing because of all the different elements of the problem, all the variables. It's very hard to find a way through. The building up of experience and the building up of expertise is actually not a smooth process. It's not something where you start with knowing little and there's a kind of straight line to becoming a master. As you saw in the Dreyfus model of expertise, it's different ways of thinking. It's different ways of reflecting, because an advanced beginner reflects on situations. Somebody who's strategic actually reflects on the strategy. So there's different ways of thinking that you go through. And there's actually moments where you're a master on one level, and then you start to question things again, which means you're closer to getting to the next level, and then your expertise drops for a while. So there's real confusion happening. And it's not smooth. It's a very rocky process. It all depends on active reflection and experiment by the student themselves. So the students need to be in the driving seat to a degree to make sure that they are actually sort of doing the best experiments for their learning cycles. Of course, it's a learning from failures, also a learning from successes, which is harder because successes you forget. You go, oh yeah, I did that, fine, did that. A failure forces you to learn, but learning from successes is hard. Only gradually will you get more overview about what designing is and how it works. So you can talk to second year or third year students that still have a sense of, I don't know what I'm learning here. And then you confront them with first year work and you go, oh yeah, that was very naive. But that kind of overview only gradually comes in. And it's very hard to tutor, as I said, because people are in their individual learning cycles. They start with where they are and need to be sort of helped to set up their own experiments that are the most relevant they can think of. Okay, fast forward because I'm running out of time. Arvin, I'm trying to be good at this.
Yeah, if we round up.
Yeah. So if you talk about design education for impact, what does that then mean? So what I did was just show some general variables of design education. When you talk about design, you can talk about the medium that it sits in. You can talk about its methods and its mentality. And often design education tends to focus on methods a lot. Okay, this is the trick for this. This is the tool for that. I think in the end, the mentality, that mentality of being able to deal with uncertainty, as Ted Happel said, and actually be able to be propositional and have things hanging in the air for a long time until the problem and the solution both click and then click together, is really crucial. Otherwise, so we did research, psychological research into successful design students. And if you looked at the psychological measures and then the correlation with success, tolerance for uncertainty came up tops. So students that are very uncertain actually go for the first solution because that gives them certainty. And that's when design should start. That's not when it should end. And it's very hard sort of if you do design education as part of a larger other course, is that so design education, inevitably you give some responsibility to the students and you're trying to give them this other mode of thinking. And so I studied in Delft myself. In the morning we had lectures. We just sat around and had no responsibility whatsoever. In the afternoon you had your design exercises and you had to suddenly be active and shape situations and stuff. That's very confusing. So we have to be careful with doing that. Of course, complexity is the challenge that we're trying to deal with in our fields. So we have to pick out from all of the actions of design, for all of the repertoire of things that design can bring, specifically those things that deal with complexity well. As I said, propositional thinking and situatedness are core, but we have to choose what we want to take from design. Design as a field itself is very broad. It takes 4 or 5 years to become a reasonable designer, good enough for practice. That's not what we're aiming for, but we can choose from design the things that we need to become sort of transdisciplinary. So this is where I'm really rounding off 2 sheets. A couple of years ago, I got the challenge in my university in Sydney to set up a new degree between 25 different bachelor degrees, a Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation, a double degree. And what I did there, really successfully, as it turns out, was to look at all of these practices from all of these different degrees and saying, okay, I'm not about sort of combining disciplines. I'm about sort of looking at the practices. So how do you deal with novelty in law? How do you deal with novelty in midwifery? How do you deal with novelty in journalism, etc., etc.? Look at all these practices and trying to pull them together and make them combine into new practices, new transdisciplinary practices. And as a basis for that, design processes are very useful. So behind a lot of transdisciplinary work that you're seeing happening around the world, there are actually design processes, often not called out or named in that way. Because, so I think that's a new role for design in a sense. It gives you a process in which other professions can also start to play and be sort of ready to deal with the complexity of the world out there, which is my last slide. Thank you.